The dying alien's confession about Jesus will destroy everything your church taught you. I held a scalpel over an alien's chest in that New Mexico hangar, and what he whispered through my mind about Christ wasn't in any Bible I'd ever read. This wasn't revelation. It was recognition of something ancient they've been hiding from us. I'm not talking about religion. I'm talking about a quantum field of consciousness that connects Jesus, interstellar objects like 3I-ATLAS, and every living soul across the cosmos. A truth buried for 2,000 years beneath doctrine and fear. Once you see what this dying extraterrestrial showed me about faith, there's no going back to Sunday sermons. This will shatter your comfortable beliefs, but it might also ignite the divine power sleeping inside you that churches never wanted you to access. Here's your warning. What I'm about to reveal will either awaken something extraordinary within you, or make you question everything you've built your life upon. If you're ready to face the terrifying truth about Christ's cosmic purpose, subscribe and activate the bell. Because what happened when that being's three-fingered hand touched mine will challenge the very foundation of human spirituality. Now let me tell you how it all began on that August night. It was almost midnight when the sandstorm began in Nevada. Michael Prescott had seen plenty of storms during his 3 years stationed near the abandoned research facility. But this one felt different. The wind didn't just howl, it screamed. It clawed at the reinforced windows of the monitoring station like something alive, something desperate to get in. Michael stood alone in the dimly lit room, his coffee cold in his hand, watching the radar screen flicker between green waves of static. He was a trauma surgeon, had been for 15 years, but out here he wasn't saving lives. He was monitoring equipment that mostly registered nothing. It was supposed to be a quiet post, a chance to decompress after too many 12-hour shifts, too many patients he couldn't save, too many nights lying awake wondering if God was even listening anymore. The wind slammed against the glass again, hard. The entire structure shuddered. Michael set down his mug and leaned closer to the radar display. That's when he saw it, a metallic pulse beneath the sand, sharp, distinct, about 200 yards northwest of his position. He frowned. Had to be a glitch. The equipment was old, temperamental. He'd seen false readings before, buried construction debris, old military junk left over from decades of testing in the Nevada desert. He waited, watching the screen cycle through another sweep. There it was again. Same location, same signature. His heart kicked up a notch. He told himself it was nothing, but his hands were already moving, pulling up the geological overlay, cross-referencing the signal with known objects in the area. Nothing registered, no records, no explanations. The radar swept again. The signal pulsed a third time. 3 times wasn't a coincidence. Michael grabbed his jacket off the back of the chair, his hands shaking slightly, not from fear but from something else. Adrenaline maybe, or maybe just the first spark of purpose he'd felt in months. He pulled on his sand mask, grabbed the heavy-duty flashlight from the charging station and pushed open the reinforced door. The storm hit him like a wall. Sand whipped against his face, stinging even through the mask. The wind tried to shove him back inside, but Michael leaned into it, squinting against the onslaught. His flashlight beam barely penetrated 3 feet ahead. He checked his handheld GPS, locked onto the coordinates from the radar, and started walking. Every step felt like dragging weights. The sand shifted under his boots. The wind roared in his ears, drowning out everything, even his own thoughts. For a moment, he wondered if this was insane, leaving the safety of the station in the middle of a sandstorm to chase a radar blip that was probably nothing. But then he heard it, a voice, faint, weak, not in his ears, in his head. Help. Last heartbeat. Michael froze. His breath caught in his throat. The wind didn't stop. The sand didn't stop. But for a single crystalline moment, everything else did. That voice. It sounded human, desperate, dying. But it came from beneath the sand. His training kicked in before his brain could catch up. In the ER, you didn't stop to question. You didn't overthink. You acted. Michael dropped to his knees and started digging with his hands, his gloved fingers clawing through layers of sand. The grains were hot, almost burning, kicked up by friction and wind. He dug faster, his flashlight wedged between his shoulder and neck, casting wild shadows across the disturbed ground. His fingers hit something solid, metal, smooth, cold even through his gloves. He brushed away more sand, revealing a curved surface, brushed silver, almost luminescent under his flashlight. It wasn't like any metal he'd seen before. No rust, no corrosion, just perfect, seamless curves that seemed to absorb and reflect light at the same time. Michael's pulse hammered in his temples. This wasn't debris. This wasn't anything the military had left behind. He found an edge, a seam, and then, as his fingers traced the outline, he found something else. A hatch. His hand hovered over it for half a second. Every rational part of his brain screamed at him to stop, to call this in, to get back up. But that voice, weak, fading, echoed in his mind again. Help! Michael Prescott had spent 15 years answering that call. He wasn't about to stop now. He pressed against the hatch. It gave slightly, then released with a soft hiss of air. Stale, metallic, wrong. The seam widened. Light spilled out from inside, faint and blue, pulsing like a heartbeat. And inside, something was still alive. The hatch opened with a weak crack. Michael's breath stopped. He'd opened chest cavities, seen exposed organs, witnessed trauma that would break most people. But nothing had prepared him for this. Inside the craft lay a figure. Not human. Definitely not human. Its skin was a blue-gray, the color of storm clouds just before lightning strikes. The texture looked smooth, but also translucent, like you could almost see beneath the surface if you looked long enough. It lay on its side, curled slightly, one long arm stretched toward the hatch as if it had been trying to open it from the inside. The being's chest rose and fell, barely. Each breath looked painful, labored, like a machine struggling on its last bit of fuel. Michael's hands trembled. His medical training warred with pure biological shock. This wasn't possible. This didn't exist. But it was right here in front of him. Bleeding, dying, real. He forced himself to move closer. His flashlight swept over the creature's form. Its head was slightly larger than a human's, smooth with delicate features that seemed almost sculpted. And the eyes. God, the eyes. They were open, watching him. Translucent green, like polished jade lit from within. There was intelligence there, awareness, pain. Michael reached out instinctively, fingers moving toward the creature's neck to check for a pulse. He hesitated. Where would a pulse even be? But then his training overrode his doubt. He pressed 2 fingers gently against the side of what he assumed was the neck. There, a rhythm, irregular, fluttering, weak. But there, this thing had a heartbeat. The voice came again, clearer this time, directly into his mind. Medical help, please. Michael's throat tightened. The creature wasn't just conscious, it was asking for help. In English. Or maybe not in English, but his brain was translating it that way. He didn't know. Didn't matter. What mattered was the wound. His eyes focused, the surgeon in him taking over. There, along the creature's left side, just below where ribs would be on a human. A gash, deep, ragged. Something had torn through the being's side, and the edges of the wound flickered with faint light, like dying embers. But it wasn't bleeding red. The liquid seeping from the wound was silver, thick, luminous, pooling on the metal floor of the craft. Michael's mind raced. Alien physiology, unknown biology, no frame of reference. But bleeding was bleeding. Shock was shock. If he didn't act now, this being would die. His professional instinct drowned out the fear. "I'm going to help you," Michael said aloud, his voice muffled by the mask. He didn't know if the creature could hear him with ears, but it seemed to understand. He turned and ran back toward his jeep, the storm still raging around him. His medical kit was in the back, standard trauma supplies, nothing designed for this, but it was all he had. He grabbed it, along with a battery-powered work light, and sprinted back to the half-buried craft. Inside, the creature's breathing had worsened. Faster, shallower. Michael set up the work light, flooding the interior with harsh white illumination. The craft's walls were covered in symbols he didn't recognize, and panels blinked weakly, like the whole thing was dying along with its pilot. He knelt beside the being and opened his kit. Scalpel, sutures, antiseptic, clamps, tools meant for human flesh. He had no idea if they'd even work, but he had to try. Michael cut away the strange fabric covering the wound. It felt like silk, but shimmered like metal. The gash underneath was worse than he'd thought. Deep, complex, layers of tissue that didn't match anything in his textbooks. His hands moved on instinct. He irrigated the wound with saline, watching the silver liquid mix with clear fluid. He used clamps to control what looked like bleeding vessels. thin, glowing threads that pulsed weakly. He sutured layers he didn't understand, his fingers moving with the precision of 15 years of practice. The creature watched him the entire time. Those green eyes never left his face. And that's when Michael realized something that shook him to his core. He wasn't just performing surgery, he was being trusted. This being, this impossible alien being, had placed its life in his hands. It could have fought, could have used whatever technology brought it across the stars to defend itself. Instead, it asked for help, and Michael answered. The final suture went in, the wound closed, the silver bleeding slowed, then stopped. Michael sat back, his hands shaking, covered in luminous fluid that seemed to glow brighter as it dried. The being's chest rose, fell, rose again. Steadier now, stronger. He'd done it. Against every law of biology, he knew he'd done it. And in that moment, kneeling in an alien craft, buried in the Nevada desert, Michael Prescott realized something profound. Saving a life had nothing to do with understanding it completely. Sometimes compassion was enough. Michael worked with instruments designed for human tissue on something that defied every principle he'd learned in medical school. The being's flesh, if you could even call it that, responded to his sutures like luminous fiber. Each stitch caught the light and held it, glowing faintly as the thread passed through layers that seemed both solid and translucent at once. It was like sewing together strands of captured starlight. His hands moved with practiced precision, but his mind struggled to process what he was actually doing. This wasn't anatomy. This was something else entirely. The creature watched him. Those jade-green eyes tracked every movement of Michael's hands with an unsettling calmness. No fear, no panic, just observation. Patient, trusting. Michael had seen that look before, in patients who'd accepted their fate, who'd made peace with whatever came next. But this was different. This being wasn't resigned. It was simply aware, present in a way that made Michael feel seen in return, like those eyes were reading more than just his actions. No sound came from the creature's mouth. It didn't cry out when the needle pierced tissue, didn't flinch when Michael had to go deeper to reach a damaged vessel. Just silence. And then, cutting through that silence, the voice in his head, clear, direct, impossibly calm. You understand compassion. This is faith in action. Michael's jaw tightened. He didn't respond. Couldn't respond, really. He was in the middle of the most delicate part of the procedure, closing what appeared to be a major circulatory pathway. His focus was absolute. He'd learned long ago to tune out everything except the work in front of him. Lives depended on that focus. But the words lingered anyway. Faith in action. What did that even mean? He pushed the thought aside and continued working. His fingers moved through the choreography of suturing. Loop, pull, tie, cut. Again, again. Each stitch brought the edges of the wound closer together. The silver bleeding had stopped completely now, and the tissue itself seemed to be responding. Knitting together faster than it should, almost like it was meeting him halfway. That's when he felt it. The heartbeat beneath his hands changed. It had been irregular, stuttering, barely there. But now it steadied. Not into a human rhythm, nothing that simple. It pulsed in a pattern that felt almost electrical, like a vibration more than a beat. A hum that traveled up through his fingertips and into his forearms. Michael paused, his breath catching. He pressed his palm flat against the creature's chest, feeling that strange rhythm stabilize into something consistent, something strong. He'd stabilized patients before, felt their hearts restart under his hands. But this was different. This felt like the being itself was coming back online, like he'd repaired not just tissue but some kind of circuit, some system he couldn't begin to understand. And then the craft responded. One of the panels on the wall, dormant until now, flickered to life. Soft blue light pulsed across its surface in perfect synchronization with the creature's heartbeat. Then another panel lit up. Then another. The entire interior began to glow with that same steady rhythm, like the ship itself was breathing again. Michael stared, his hands still pressed against the being's chest. The lights pulsed, the heartbeat pulsed, and somewhere deep in the back of his mind, he felt something pulse too. Something he couldn't name, couldn't quite grasp. The voice came again, gentle, filling his awareness. Your touch awakens healing frequencies. Michael didn't understand. Not intellectually, not in any way he could explain or defend in a medical journal. But in that moment, kneeling in an alien craft with his hands on a being from another world, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace, not relief, not satisfaction at a job well done. This was deeper, quieter, like a part of him that had been holding its breath for a decade finally exhaled. He didn't know what healing frequencies were, didn't know if what he'd just done followed any real medical logic, or if he'd simply gotten lucky with tools that happened to work on biology they were never designed for. But the creature was breathing steadily now. The wound was closed. The bleeding had stopped. Michael pulled his hands back slowly and looked down at them. They were still covered in that luminous silver fluid, now dried and cracking slightly, catching the pulsing blue light from the panels. His hands, the same hands that had sutured hundreds of wounds, that had held beating hearts, that had signed death certificates when there was nothing left to do. These hands had just saved something impossible. He sat back on his heels, exhaustion crashing over him all at once. His shoulders sagged. His breath came in shaky pulls. And somewhere in the depths of his chest, beneath the fatigue and the shock and the sheer absurdity of what had just happened, he felt something stir. It wasn't belief exactly. Michael Prescott had lost his faith 3 years ago in an operating room when a 6-year-old girl had died on his table despite everything he'd done. Every perfect incision, every textbook procedure executed flawlessly. He'd prayed that night, really prayed, begged, pleaded, and heard only silence in return. He'd stopped praying after that. But this felt like an answer to a question he'd forgotten he'd asked. Not about God, not about religion or doctrine or whether the universe was listening. Something simpler, something older. He'd just participated in a miracle. Maybe not the kind they talk about in churches, but a miracle nonetheless. Michael looked at the creature, and the creature looked back, and in that shared glance, something passed between them. Understanding maybe, recognition, the acknowledgement that something profound had just occurred in this half-buried craft in the Nevada desert. The being's lips didn't move, but Michael heard the gratitude anyway, felt it, not as words, but as warmth spreading through his chest. He'd saved a life tonight, not a human life, but a life. And for the first time since that little girl had died, Michael Prescott felt like maybe, just maybe, his hands were meant for more than failure. When the being regained its strength, it lifted one long, slender hand and touched Michael's forearm. The moment contact was made, Michael's vision exploded, not with light or pain, but with images, vast, overwhelming, impossible to look away from. Stars wheeling across infinite darkness, planets in perfect orbital dance, nebulae blooming like flowers across the cosmic garden, and through it all, a path, a trajectory, a brilliant object moving through the void with purpose, and a name, burning itself into his awareness. 3I-ATLAS. Michael gasped, pulling back instinctively, but the images followed him, imprinted behind his eyelids. His heart hammered. His breath came fast. What? What was that? His voice cracked. The being's touch remained gentle on his arm. The telepathic voice was clearer now, stronger, no longer weak and fading. Not a comet, a beacon of consciousness. Michael's mind reeled. 3I-ATLAS. He'd heard that name before, read about it in passing maybe, in some scientific article he'd skimmed during a sleepless night. An interstellar object, detected by astronomers, analyzed, cataloged, dismissed as just another chunk of ice and rock passing through our solar system. But the being was telling him something different, something that made no sense and perfect sense all at once. 3I-ATLAS transmits waves of compassion to civilizations in moral collapse. The words settled into Michael's chest like stones dropping into still water, sending ripples outward. Waves of compassion, not radio signals, not data, compassion. As if compassion were a tangible thing, a force that could be broadcast across light years, received by those who needed it most. He thought of Earth, of the news he'd stopped watching because it was too bleak, of the wars, the hatred, the endless cycle of suffering. Moral collapse felt like an understatement. Why me? Michael heard himself ask. His voice was barely a whisper. Why tell me this? Why let me find you? The being tilted its head slightly, those translucent green eyes holding his with impossible depth. Because you forgot that saving is a sacred act. The words hit Michael like a physical blow. He felt his throat tighten. His eyes burned. He wanted to argue. Wanted to say that he'd never forgotten, that he'd dedicated his entire life to saving people, that he'd sacrificed relationships and sleep and any semblance of a normal life to be good at what he did. But even as the denials formed, he knew they were lies. He had forgotten. Somewhere along the way, between the endless shifts and the impossible cases and the patients who died despite his best efforts, he'd stopped seeing the sacredness of it. Surgery had become mechanics. Bodies had become problems to solve. And when he couldn't solve them, when his hands failed and his training wasn't enough, he'd stopped believing there was any meaning to it at all. The being's voice continued, soft but unyielding. You heal bodies, but you forgot the spirit behind them. Michael's vision blurred. He thought of all those nights, the ones where he'd sat alone in his car in the hospital parking lot, too tired to drive home, too numb to cry. The ones where he'd stared at his hands and wondered what the point was. The ones where he'd stopped praying because it felt like shouting into a void. He'd been going through the motions, saving lives because it was his job, not because he believed it mattered, not because he felt the weight and wonder of it anymore. I tried, Michael said, his voice breaking. I tried to keep caring, but they kept dying. And God, if there even is a God, never answered, never helped, never. Every time you chose to try again, that was the answer. The simplicity of it cut through everything. Michael's breath caught. You heal bodies, but you forgot the spirit behind them. Those words settled deep, deeper than logic, deeper than argument. Every patient wasn't just a body. They were a person, a soul, someone loved by others, loved by the universe itself, worthy of care not because of what they could offer, but simply because they were. He'd known that once, felt it in his bones when he'd first decided to become a surgeon. But years of trauma and loss and exhaustion had buried it under scar tissue, until tonight, until an impossible being in an impossible craft had reminded him of something so simple it hurt. The being's hand remained on his arm, and Michael felt that strange warmth again. Not physical heat, but something else. Something that traveled through him like a current, soft and persistent, touching places in his chest he'd forgotten existed. For the first time in 3 years, since that little girl died, Michael Prescott felt something crack open inside him. Not breaking, opening. Like a door he'd nailed shut was being gently, insistently pushed ajar. It wasn't faith, not in the way he'd understood it before. It wasn't belief in doctrines or certainties about the afterlife. It was simpler than that, more fundamental. It was the recognition that what he did mattered, that the act of caring, of trying, of showing up, of using his hands to mend what was broken, was sacred whether he believed in God or not. Compassion didn't need doctrine. It didn't need proof. It just needed to be practiced. Michael looked at the being, this impossible visitor from beyond the stars, and felt tears finally break free. They ran down his cheeks, hot and cleansing, and for the first time in years, he didn't fight them. The being's telepathic voice was gentle, almost affectionate. Now you remember. And Michael did. He remembered why he'd chosen this path, remembered the awe he'd felt the first time he'd held a beating heart in his hands, remembered believing that healing was holy work. He'd lost that, but tonight, in the strangest circumstances imaginable, he'd found it again. The being gestured toward the center of the craft with one long, graceful finger. Michael turned, following the silent direction, and his breath caught in his throat. At the heart of the vessel, suspended in what looked like empty air, a spiral of light pulsed with rhythmic precision. It wasn't mechanical, wasn't a projection or hologram. It was alive, breathing, beating, turning slowly, like a miniature galaxy caught in perfect rotation. Blues and silvers and hints of gold threaded through the spiral, each pulse sending ripples of luminescence across the craft's interior walls. It was beautiful, hypnotic, and somehow deeply familiar. This is the same as your heart, energy and intention. Michael stared at the spiral, then down at his own chest, feeling his heartbeat thudding steadily beneath his ribs. The comparison seemed absurd at first. His heart was muscle and blood, chambers and valves, entirely biological. But as he watched the spiral pulse, he began to see it. The rhythm, the purpose, the way each beat sustained everything around it. The universe operates through vibrations of service and care. The words washed over Michael like a wave. Service and care. Not gravity. Not electromagnetic forces. Or maybe those were just other names for the same thing. The fundamental pull that held everything together, kept planets in orbit, kept hearts beating, kept surgeons working through the night to save strangers they'd never met. Every compassionate gesture strengthens the field that sustains worlds. Michael's scientific mind wanted to reject it. Compassion wasn't a force, wasn't measurable, couldn't be quantified or graphed or peer-reviewed. But standing there, watching that spiral pulse in perfect synchronization with his own heartbeat, he felt the truth of it in a way that transcended logic. Every time he'd chosen to care when it would have been easier not to. Every time he'd stayed late, pushed harder, refused to give up on a patient. Every small act of kindness in the face of overwhelming suffering. Maybe those weren't just good deeds. Maybe they were something more fundamental. Acts that literally held reality together. Faith is not belief, but coherent action. That hit different. Michael had spent years thinking faith meant believing in things he couldn't prove. Heaven, hell, God watching from above, prayers being answered. And when those beliefs crumbled under the weight of too much death, he'd thought he'd lost his faith entirely. But what if faith was never about believing the right things? What if it was about doing them? Acting with love even when you couldn't see the outcome. Serving even when you felt empty. Continuing to care when everything screamed at you to stop. That kind of faith didn't require certainty. It required commitment. The being gestured again, inviting Michael closer to the spiral. He hesitated only a moment before stepping forward. His hand reached out, trembling slightly, and his fingertips touched the edge of the light. The sensation was immediate. A tingling warmth spread from his fingers up through his palm, his wrist, his forearm. Not painful, not overwhelming, just present, like touching pure potential. Like his hand had made contact with something that existed between energy and matter, something that was both and neither. The tingling traveled up to his shoulder, across his chest, settling somewhere deep in the center of his ribcage. He gasped softly, not from pain, but from recognition. It felt like something clicking into place, like a frequency he'd been off-tuned from his entire life suddenly finding its proper resonance. This is 3I-ATLAS within you now. Michael pulled his hand back slowly, staring at his palm. It looked the same. No marks, no changes. But he felt different, calibrated, connected to something vast and ancient and utterly present. The message crystallized in his mind with perfect clarity. Compassion wasn't just an emotion or a virtue. It was a law, physical and spiritual at once. As real as gravity, as necessary as oxygen. The force that held atoms together and made strangers stop to help each other. The frequency that 3I-ATLAS transmitted across the cosmos to civilizations on the brink. And now it pulsed inside him. Michael's vision blurred. Tears came without warning, spilling down his cheeks in hot streams. He didn't try to stop them, didn't feel embarrassed. For 3 years he'd been numb, locked inside himself, moving through life like a machine performing functions, saving bodies without feeling the weight of it, operating without awe. But now, now, he felt everything. The beauty of what he'd just witnessed. The profound gift of being allowed to see this, to touch it, to carry it forward. The crushing realization of how much time he'd wasted being bitter when he could have been grateful. The stunning simplicity of the truth he'd just been shown. Love wasn't soft or weak or sentimental. Love was structural, the foundation of reality itself. Michael dropped to his knees, his hands covering his face, and wept like he hadn't since childhood. Deep, shaking sobs that came from somewhere primal and honest. He was relearning how to feel, relearning how to be fully human, and it hurt in the best possible way, like blood returning to a limb that had fallen asleep, painful but necessary, the price of coming back to life. The being remained silent, simply present, allowing him this moment. And in that silence, Michael Prescott let himself break open completely, let the walls crumble, let the numbness drain away. Let himself feel the terrifying, beautiful weight of being alive in a universe held together by compassion. When he finally looked up, eyes red and swollen, the spiral was still pulsing, still beating, still holding everything together, just like his heart. Just like every heart that chose, against all odds, to keep loving. Michael wiped his face with the back of his hand and looked at the being with raw honesty. "I lost my faith," he said quietly. His voice cracked on the word faith. 3 years ago, A little girl, 6 years old, car accident. The memories flooded back. Her small body on the table, his team working with desperate precision, every procedure executed perfectly, and her dying anyway, coding, flatlining, gone. I did everything right, Michael continued, his throat tight. Everything. I prayed during the surgery, begged God to let me save her. And she died on my table while I was literally holding her heart in my hands. He looked down at those hands now, stained with luminous silver, hands that had saved an alien life tonight but couldn't save a human child 3 years ago. After that, God felt absent, especially in the ER, especially when people died no matter what I did. It felt like screaming into a void, so I stopped praying, stopped believing, just showed up and did the work, because that's what I'm trained to do. The being listened without judgment, those green eyes holding steady compassion. God is the impulse that makes you keep operating. Michael blinked, opened his mouth, closed it. When you save someone, you are already in prayer. The words hit him like a physical blow. He'd been thinking of prayer as something separate from his work. Words said in church, requests made on bended knee, rituals performed in designated sacred spaces. But what if prayer was the work itself? The showing up, the refusing to quit, the choosing to care when caring hurt. He'd been praying for 3 years without realizing it. Every surgery, every patient, every time he'd pushed through exhaustion because someone needed him. That was prayer. Active, embodied, real. Michael sat in silence, the logic of it unfolding in his mind like a flower blooming. It was so simple, so obvious. How had he missed it? Faith is keeping love active when everything seems lost. That phrase sank into him, heavy and true. He thought of all the times he'd wanted to quit, wanted to walk away from medicine, from the constant exposure to trauma and grief. But he hadn't. He'd kept showing up, kept trying, even when he felt empty, even when he thought it didn't matter. That was faith. Not the bright, certain kind they sang about in hymns, but the stubborn, grinding kind that kept you moving through darkness because the alternative was abandoning people who needed you. The being's telepathic voice grew softer, more intimate. Repeat this in your mind. To serve is to worship. Michael closed his eyes, drew a breath. Let the words form in his thoughts. To serve is to worship. He repeated it. To serve is to worship. Again. To serve is to worship. The moment the phrase completed its third repetition, something shifted. The interior of the craft filled with blue light, not from the panels or the spiral, but from everywhere at once, as if the air itself had become luminous, gentle, warm, enveloping. Michael opened his eyes, and the light didn't fade. It pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat, with the spiral at the craft's center, with something vast and cosmic beyond the walls of this small vessel. To serve is to worship. It wasn't just words. It was truth carved into the fabric of existence. Every act of genuine care, whether for a patient, a stranger, an alien being bleeding silver in the desert, was an act of worship. Not worship of a distant deity demanding obedience, but participation in the fundamental force that held reality together. Love in action, compassion made concrete, service as the highest form of devotion. Michael felt something inside him shift permanently, a realization that would change everything. He didn't need a church to worship, didn't need a priest or a holy book or perfect theology. He had his hands, his training, his choice to show up and care when it mattered. That was enough. That was everything. The blue light faded slowly, but the truth remained, permanent, undeniable. He looked at the being, tears streaming freely down his face again, but this time they were different. Not grief, not pain, just overwhelming recognition. Every surgery was prayer. Every healed wound was worship. Every moment he chose compassion over despair was an act of faith more profound than any ritual. He'd thought he'd lost God, but God had been there all along, in his hands, in his persistence, in his refusal to let suffering have the final word. I understand, Michael whispered. I finally understand. And he did. The being shifted slightly, its movements more fluid now. The emergency passed. When it spoke again, the telepathic voice carried a different quality, not urgent or weak, but purposeful. Teaching. 3I-ATLAS is not an object. It is traveling consciousness. Michael's brow furrowed. He'd read the reports, seen the data. 3I-ATLAS had been tracked, measured, analyzed by astronomers around the world. Mass, velocity, trajectory, all calculated with precision. A chunk of rock and ice from another star system passing through ours. But the being was telling him something else entirely. It is sent to worlds that have forgotten the unity between science and love. Science and love, two words that felt like they belonged in different universes. One was objective, measurable, provable. The other was subjective, emotional, impossible to quantify. Michael had lived his entire professional life in the realm of science, believing that feelings were separate from facts, that medicine was about technique and knowledge, not sentiment. You treat healing as technique, not as reverence. The words stung because they were true. Michael thought of the hospital, the way doctors talked about patients as cases. Room 4 needs intubation. The GSW in Trauma Bay 2. The MI in the cath lab. Reducing human beings to their injuries, their diagnoses, their insurance codes. Efficient, maybe, but reverent? Never. We come to remind that compassion is the true medicine. Michael's mind immediately went to his colleagues. Dr. Sandra Chen, who'd been working 80-hour weeks for the past 2 years and looked like a ghost. Tom Rodriguez, the ER resident who'd started having panic attacks between shifts. Emily Park, who'd told him last month she was thinking of quitting because she couldn't take watching people die anymore. They were all brilliant, all skilled, all burning out because they'd forgotten, or never learned, what the being was telling him now, that healing required more than knowledge. It required heart, soul, the willingness to see each patient as sacred. They need to hear this, Michael said, his voice urgent. My colleagues, the other doctors, everyone in healthcare. They're drowning. Maybe this, what you're telling me, maybe this could save them. The being tilted its head, and Michael could swear he saw something like gentle amusement in those translucent eyes. Show, don't preach. Michael opened his mouth to argue, then stopped. He'd seen enough zealots in his life. People who'd found some truth and immediately tried to convert everyone around them with words, endless words. Most people just tuned them out, rolled their eyes, dismissed them as crazy. Perform your surgery as prayer, and they will feel it. The simplicity of it took Michael's breath away. He didn't need to explain quantum consciousness or interstellar beacons or telepathic aliens. He didn't need to convince anyone of anything. He just needed to work differently. Operate with reverence instead of routine. Treat each patient as a sacred trust instead of a medical problem. And people would notice. They'd feel the difference even if they couldn't name it. Patients would recover better. The operating room would feel different. Other doctors would wonder what had changed. And maybe, just maybe, they'd start asking questions. The lesson crystallized with perfect clarity. Faith without practice was just empty words. It didn't matter what you believed if you didn't live it. And living it didn't require speeches or sermons. It required showing up differently, acting from a place of love instead of fear or duty or exhaustion. Michael looked at the being with new understanding. You didn't come here to give me answers. You came to remind me of something I already knew but forgot. Yes, and 3I-ATLAS isn't here to save us. It's here to wake us up. Yes. Michael felt the weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders. Not a burden, more like a calling. He thought of all the patients he'd see in the coming weeks and months, all the surgeries he'd perform, all the opportunities to practice this new old way of healing. I'll do it, he said firmly. I'll change the way I operate. Not just the technique, the intention behind it, the awareness. The being's eyes seemed to brighten, and Michael felt approval wash over him like warm water. This is why you were chosen. Not because you are perfect, but because you are willing. Chosen. The word rattled around in Michael's head. He'd never felt chosen for anything. Just a guy who studied hard, went to medical school, did his job. Nothing special. But maybe being chosen had nothing to do with being extraordinary. Maybe it just meant being open, being willing to change, being humble enough to admit you'd been doing it wrong and brave enough to try doing it right. I promise, Michael said, and the words felt like an oath, like something binding and permanent. I promise I'll remember. I'll keep the reverence. I'll treat healing as sacred. The being reached out and touched Michael's shoulder, and the gesture felt ancient, ceremonial, a blessing passing from one healer to another across the vast distances between worlds. Then our meeting was not by chance, and your world has hope. Michael nodded, blinking back fresh tears. He understood now. This wasn't about him. It was about everyone he'd touched going forward. Every patient, every student, every exhausted colleague who'd see him work and wonder why he seemed different, calmer, more present. Ripples. He was being asked to create ripples, and those ripples would spread. 3 hours after Michael had closed the last suture, the being's vital signs, if you could call them that, had stabilized completely. Michael monitored the pulse with his fingers pressed gently against the creature's neck, feeling that strange electrical rhythm beat steady and strong. The blue-gray skin had transformed, taking on a silvery luminescence that made the being look less like something dying and more like something thriving. The translucent quality remained, but now it seemed intentional, beautiful, like looking at water lit from beneath. The creature's eyes opened fully, sharp, focused, fully present. It tried to sit up, moving slowly, testing its strength. Michael instinctively reached out to help, one hand supporting the being's back. The movement was almost automatic, the same gesture he'd made 1,000 times helping patients sit up in hospital beds. But then the being winced slightly, and Michael's eyes darted to the craft around them. Several panels were dark. Wires hung loose from damaged sections. The spiral at the center still pulsed, but dimmer than before, like a heart beating through injury. "Your ship is hurt too," Michael said, stating the obvious. The being nodded, attempting to stand but faltering. The craft shuddered slightly in response, as if ship and pilot were connected in ways Michael couldn't fully grasp. Michael looked around, his mind shifting into problem-solving mode. He wasn't an engineer, but he understood systems, inputs, outputs, connections. And right now, this ship needed the same thing his patient had needed: stabilization. He spotted a support beam that had partially collapsed. Without thinking, he moved to it, bracing it back into position with his shoulder while looking for something to secure it with. He found a length of cable, organic-looking but sturdy, and began wrapping it, creating a makeshift support structure. Next, he traced the loose wires to their sources, carefully reconnecting what seemed obvious, avoiding what looked too complex or dangerous to touch. His hands moved with the same careful precision they used in surgery, respectful of the system, aware that one wrong move could cause more damage. A panel flickered back to life, then another. "Now you heal machines too." The being's voice carried unmistakable amusement, and when Michael looked over, the creature was actually smiling, or doing whatever the alien equivalent was, a slight curve to the mouth that conveyed warmth and gentle humor. Michael felt something crack open in his chest. Laughter, actual laughter. It burst out of him unexpectedly, rusty and genuine, and he realized with a shock that he couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed. Really laughed. Not a polite chuckle or a sarcastic snort, but real, honest-to-God laughter that came from joy. "I guess healing is healing," Michael said, grinning despite himself. "Doesn't matter if it's flesh or metal. Healing begins when fear ends." The laughter faded, but the warmth remained. Michael paused, a cable still in his hands, and let those words sink in. Fear. It had been fear all along, hadn't it? Fear of failure. Fear of losing patience. Fear that his work didn't matter, that he wasn't good enough, that God wasn't listening. Fear had wrapped around his heart like scar tissue, making everything harder, making him numb. But tonight, kneeling in an alien craft, saving an impossible life, learning truths that rewrote everything he thought he knew, he'd been too focused to be afraid, too present, too engaged in the act of serving to worry about outcomes or judgment, or whether he was doing it right. He'd just done it, and in that doing, fear had evaporated like morning mist. "The fear is what's been paralyzing me," Michael said quietly, more to himself than to the being. "For years, I was so afraid of failing again that I stopped really trying, went through the motions, protected myself by not caring too much. Yes, but when I accepted that my job was just to serve, to show up and do my best without needing to control the outcome, I felt," he searched for the word, "peace, real peace." The being nodded slowly, and Michael felt a wave of acknowledgement wash over him. The lesson had been received, integrated. The fear that had controlled him for 3 years was losing its grip. Service didn't require fearlessness. It just required willingness. Showing up even when you were afraid. Caring even when caring might lead to pain. Operating even when you couldn't guarantee success. That was the path forward. Not the absence of fear, but the choice to serve despite it. The being reached out and placed one long-fingered hand on Michael's shoulder. The touch was gentle but firm, final. "You understand now." It wasn't a question. "I do," Michael said, and meant it completely. The ship hummed around them, systems coming back online one by one, and Michael understood that this too was a kind of healing. Everything he'd learned tonight, about compassion and faith and the sacred nature of service, applied to everything, not just medicine. All of existence operated on the same principles. Love was the structure, service was worship, and fear was just the illusion that we were separate from the source. The being smiled again, and this time Michael smiled back, feeling lighter than he had in years. The wind stopped, just like that. One moment the sandstorm was raging, howling like something alive, and the next, complete stillness. Michael stepped out of the craft and looked up. The sky had cleared, revealing a blanket of stars so dense and brilliant it took his breath away. He'd never seen the Milky Way like this, even out in the Nevada desert. It looked close enough to touch, like he could reach up and run his fingers through cosmic dust. The being emerged behind him, moving with fluid grace now, fully recovered. It stood beside Michael in the quiet darkness, both of them gazing upward at the infinite canvas above. "I must return to the gravitational field of 3I-ATLAS." Michael nodded, throat tight. He'd known this moment was coming, but knowing didn't make it easier. In the span of a few hours, this impossible encounter had changed everything. He wasn't ready for it to end. "You were prepared without knowing it." Michael turned to look at the being, questions forming. "Prepared how? I didn't know any of this was coming. I was just here. Every patient you saved despite your doubt. Every night you showed up exhausted but still tried. Every moment you chose to care when it would have been easier not to. All of it was preparation." The word settled over Michael like a blessing. His entire journey, the pain, the loss, the crisis of faith, hadn't been wasted. It had been shaping him for this moment, teaching him through suffering what joy alone never could. Now carry this frequency to those who suffer. The responsibility felt immense, but not crushing. Michael understood what was being asked. Not to preach or proselytize, but simply to embody what he'd learned, to operate with reverence, to treat each patient as sacred, to let love guide his hands as much as knowledge did. "Will I see you again?" The question escaped before he could stop it, vulnerable and childlike. The being turned those translucent green eyes toward him, and Michael saw warmth there, deep, genuine affection that transcended species or worlds. "We see each other every time you choose love." The simplicity of it made Michael's eyes sting. Not a promise of physical reunion, but something better, something permanent. Every act of compassion would be a meeting. Every moment of genuine care would close the distance between them. They weren't saying goodbye. They were establishing a connection that couldn't be broken by distance or time. The being moved back toward the craft, and Michael watched as the damaged sections began sealing themselves, panels sliding into place, the ship restoring itself with technology he couldn't begin to understand. The spiral at its center pulsed brighter, preparing for departure. The craft lifted. No sound, no roar of engines, just a gentle rising, as if gravity had simply stopped applying. It rotated slowly, almost gracefully, aligning itself with something Michael couldn't see. He raised his hand in farewell. The being was visible through a translucent section of the hull, one long-fingered hand raised in mirror to his own, and then the craft shot upward, so fast Michael's eyes could barely track it. One moment it was there, and the next it was gone, a silver streak disappearing into the stars, becoming indistinguishable from the infinite points of light above. The desert fell quiet, profoundly, completely quiet. No wind, no distant highway sounds, just silence pressing in from all sides. But Michael's heart beat differently now, steadier, fuller, like it had been out of rhythm his entire life and only now found its proper tempo. He stood there for a long time, staring at the stars, feeling something he hadn't felt in 3 years. Connection, not loneliness, not the crushing isolation that had followed him through hospital corridors and empty parking lots and sleepless nights, but a sense of being woven into something vast and purposeful, part of a network of consciousness that stretched across galaxies, held together by the simple, profound force of compassion. For the first time since that little girl died on his operating table, Michael Prescott didn't feel alone. He felt accompanied by the being who'd touched his life for a few precious hours, by the presence of 3I-ATLAS somewhere out there in the cosmic dark, by every soul who'd ever chosen to serve despite suffering, by the fundamental frequency of love that held reality together. Something inside him had been reconnected, a circuit completed, a dormant part of his soul brought back online. Michael took a deep breath of cool desert air and smiled. Real, genuine, the kind of smile that came from the center of your chest, not from social obligation. He turned and walked back toward his Jeep, his boots crunching on sand that still held warmth from the day. The monitoring station sat quiet in the distance, lights blinking their routine patterns. Everything looked the same as when he'd left it hours ago. But he was different, fundamentally, irrevocably different. And tomorrow, when he returned to the hospital, he'd carry this frequency with him, into operating rooms, into patient interactions, into every moment where he had the choice to serve with reverence or simply go through the motions. The being had trusted him with something precious. And Michael Prescott, trauma surgeon, former skeptic, newly awakened healer, would not let that trust be wasted. 5 days later, Michael walked back through the doors of Nevada Memorial Hospital in Las Vegas. The automatic doors slid open with their familiar hiss. The smell hit him immediately. Antiseptic, floor cleaner, the underlying scent of bodies and stress and cafeteria food. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Nurses hurried past with clipboards and medication trays. Someone's pager went off. A phone rang at the front desk. Everything looked exactly the same, except Michael wasn't the same man who'd left for his desert monitoring assignment 2 weeks ago. He checked in at the surgical department, picked up his schedule, reviewed the cases waiting for him. Routine, normal, the same procedures he'd performed hundreds of times. But as he scrubbed in for his first surgery, a motorcycle accident victim with internal bleeding, his hands moved differently. Not in technique. The technique was the same, honed by years of practice. But in awareness, he remembered the being's words, "Perform your surgery as prayer." Michael positioned himself at the table, looking down at the patient. A young man, maybe 25, unconscious, vulnerable, his life literally in Michael's hands. And for the first time in years, Michael truly saw him. Not as a case, not as Trauma Bay 3, but as a person, a son, maybe a brother, someone loved, someone worthy of reverence. Michael took a breath and began. His hands moved with practiced precision, but his mind held a new quality, calm, centered. Each incision felt intentional, not just technically correct, but somehow sacred. He was aware of his own heartbeat, steady and strong, aware of the way his breath synchronized with his movements, aware of the profound responsibility and privilege of this work. The surgical team noticed immediately. "Dr. Prescott, you okay?" Sarah, his longtime scrub nurse, asked after the first 30 minutes. "You seem different." Michael glanced up briefly, his eyes meeting hers over his mask. "I'm good." Better than good. And he was. The usual background tension that accompanied every surgery, the fear of complications, the anxiety about outcomes, was gone. Not because he was cavalier or overconfident, but because he'd released the need to control everything. His job was to serve with skill and care. The outcome was beyond his hands, held by forces larger than his will. The surgery progressed smoothly. Too smoothly, really. The bleeding controlled faster than expected. The repairs held perfectly. The patient's vitals stayed stable throughout. 4 hours later, Michael closed the final layer of sutures and stepped back. The young man would live, against the odds. His injuries had been severe, his chances uncertain. He would survive. Michael felt gratitude rise in his chest. Not pride, not relief, just pure, simple gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered under his breath, not directed at anyone or anything specific. Just an acknowledgement of the mystery and grace that allowed healing to happen. He'd understood something crucial in that moment. Faith wasn't about believing first and then seeing results. It was about offering gratitude before knowing the outcome, trusting that serving with love was enough, regardless of whether the patient lived or died. In the locker room afterward, 2 of his colleagues cornered him. "What happened to you?" Dr. Chen asked, her exhausted eyes studying him with curiosity. "You were so calm in there, so present." It was like watching a completely different surgeon. Tom Rodriguez nodded agreement. "Seriously, man, whatever meditation retreat you went on, I need the brochure." Michael smiled, pulling off his scrubs. How could he possibly explain that he'd operated on a dying alien in the Nevada desert? that a cosmic consciousness called 3I-ATLAS had shown him that love was a physical law, that every surgery was an act of worship, they'd think he'd lost his mind. So he kept it simple. "I learned that love is also a technique," Michael said quietly. "Not separate from the medical skill, but part of it. When you treat each patient as sacred, everything changes." Dr. Chen stared at him for a long moment. He could see her skepticism, but also something else. Hunger. The desperate hope of someone drowning who'd just been thrown a rope. "Show me," she said finally, and Michael smiled, remembering the being's words. "Show, don't preach. Tomorrow, scrub in with me. Watch how I work, then decide for yourself." He didn't need to convince them with words. He just needed to embody the truth. Live it. Let them feel the difference. The rest would take care of itself. Michael began training residents differently. It started small. A comment here, a demonstration there. But within weeks, his approach to teaching had fundamentally shifted. He wasn't just showing them how to cut and suture. He was teaching them how to be present. "Before you make the first incision," he'd say, standing beside a resident at the operating table, "take a breath. Feel your own heartbeat. Remember that you're not just working on tissue. You're holding someone's life, their future. Treat it with the reverence it deserves." Some residents nodded politely, clearly thinking he'd gone soft or eccentric. Others listened with genuine curiosity, sensing something deeper in his words, even if they couldn't quite articulate what. Michael taught concentration, not just technical focus, but spiritual awareness. "Every cell responds to the intention of the person touching it," he'd explain, his hands demonstrating a particular suturing technique. "Your hands carry more than skill. They carry your state of mind, your emotional energy, your respect or lack of it." Dr. James Patterson, a third-year resident, actually laughed the first time he heard this. "Dr. Prescott, with all due respect, cells don't have feelings. They respond to biological stimuli, not vibes." Michael didn't argue, didn't defend himself or launch into explanations about quantum consciousness or alien encounters. He simply smiled and said, "Watch the outcomes, then decide." And the outcomes spoke for themselves. Within 2 months, the surgical department noticed a pattern. Patients who went through procedures with Michael or his trained residents experienced fewer complications. Infection rates dropped. Recovery times shortened. Post-operative pain seemed less severe. The data was undeniable. Dr. Chen, who'd started observing Michael's surgeries regularly, brought the statistics to a departmental meeting. "I don't know what to make of this," she admitted, "but there's a measurable difference. Dr. Prescott's patients are recovering faster across the board." Michael sat quietly at the back of the conference room, letting the data speak for itself. He didn't need credit, didn't need recognition. He just needed people to see that the approach worked. Young Dr. Patterson, the skeptic, approached him after the meeting. "I still don't understand the mechanism," he said honestly, "but I can't argue with results. Will you show me? Really show me what you're doing?" "Of course," Michael replied. Over the following weeks, he worked closely with Patterson and several other residents. He taught them to pause before each surgery and set an intention, not for success or recognition, but for service. To see each patient not as a problem to solve, but as a sacred trust. "When you're exhausted and your hands are shaking from too many hours," Michael told them during a late-night teaching session, "remember why you started this. Not the prestige or the salary. The moment you first realized you could ease suffering. That's the frequency you need to reconnect to." He taught them breath awareness, how to use their own calm to create a calmer operating room. He taught them gratitude practices, taking a moment after each successful procedure to simply be thankful rather than rushing to the next case. Some of the older surgeons rolled their eyes, called it woo-woo nonsense. But the younger generation was hungry for it, desperate for something that made the brutal hours and emotional weight of medicine feel meaningful again. Michael never mentioned 3I-ATLAS, never talked about the being in the desert. He simply lived the truth he'd been shown and let that truth ripple outward through example. Late at night, after a particularly long shift, he'd sit alone in his car and whisper to himself, 3I-ATLAS works through those who serve. It was becoming clearer every day. The cosmic consciousness wasn't some distant force observing from afar. It was active, present, flowing through anyone who chose to align with it. Every act of genuine compassion amplified the field. Every moment of true service strengthened the frequency. The lesson repeated in his mind like a mantra. To serve is to worship. Not worship in the traditional sense, not bowing before an altar or reciting prayers from a book, but worship as action, as embodiment, as the choice to show up with love even when you're exhausted, even when you're scared, even when you don't know if it will make a difference. Faith had stopped being something Michael thought about or debated in his head. It had become something he practiced, daily, hourly, in every interaction with patients, nurses, residents, even the janitors who cleaned the operating rooms. Faith was the hands that healed, the intention that guided them, the gratitude that followed, the willingness to serve without needing to control outcomes. Dr. Patterson pulled Michael aside one evening after a complex surgery they'd performed together. The young resident's eyes were bright, almost emotional. "I felt it today," Patterson said quietly. "In there, I wasn't just operating. I don't know how to describe it, connected to the patient, to you, to something bigger than all of us." Michael put a hand on the young man's shoulder. "That's the frequency. You've tapped into it. Now you just have to keep choosing it." Patterson nodded, clearly moved. "Thank you for showing me this, for not giving up when I dismissed it." "I didn't need you to believe," Michael said simply. "I just needed you to practice it. Belief follows experience, not the other way around." Walking through the hospital corridors that night, Michael felt the weight of responsibility and the lightness of purpose in equal measure. He was changing his corner of the world, one resident at a time, one surgery at a time, one moment of reverent service at a time. The being had been right. You don't preach the truth, you embody it. And when you embody it consistently enough, others begin to feel it, begin to hunger for it, begin to practice it themselves. That's how consciousness evolves, not through arguments or conversions, through demonstration, through the undeniable evidence of love made practical. 6 months after the encounter, Michael drove back out to the Nevada desert. He didn't tell anyone where he was going, just took a personal day and pointed his Jeep toward the coordinates he'd memorized, the place where everything had changed. The monitoring station was still there, abandoned and quiet, exactly as he'd left it. Michael parked and walked out into the vast emptiness. The sun was setting, painting the sky in layers of orange and purple and deep blue. The air was cool. The only sound was the crunch of his boots on sand. He found the spot, or thought he did. It was hard to be certain. The desert had a way of erasing evidence, shifting dunes, covering and uncovering secrets according to wind and time. But something in his chest told him this was the place. The sand showed no sign of disturbance, no metallic gleam beneath the surface, no evidence that anything unusual had ever been here. But Michael felt it anyway, that vibration in his chest, that subtle hum that matched the rhythm of his own heartbeat, the same frequency he'd felt when he touched the spiral at the center of the craft. He knelt down and pressed his palm flat against the sand, warm from the day's sun, ordinary, just desert. Yet the vibration persisted, and that's when Michael understood with complete clarity. 3I-ATLAS hadn't left. It had never been about the object, the craft, or even the being. It was about the consciousness, the frequency, and that frequency didn't exist somewhere out in space. It pulsed inside him, inside everyone who chose to align with it. He thought of the being's words. Love is physical law. For months he'd been proving that truth. In operating rooms, in teaching sessions, in every moment he chose compassion over fear, service over ego, reverence over routine. Love wasn't just a feeling or a moral virtue. It was the fundamental force that organized reality, as real as gravity, as measurable as the improved outcomes in his patients. Michael smiled, looking out across the desert toward the horizon, where earth met sky in a perfect line. Science and faith, two words that people treated as opposites, as incompatible worldviews that required choosing sides. But they weren't opposites at all. They were partners, two languages describing the same truth. Science measured the mechanics. Faith experienced the meaning. Together they formed a complete picture of how the universe actually worked. He felt it suddenly, a profound sense of connection, not just to his own life or the people he served, but to everything. The sand beneath his knees, the air in his lungs, the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky, the whole world breathing together, held in a web of consciousness that linked every living thing, separate but unified, individual but interconnected, alone but never truly alone. The final lesson crystallized in his mind with the clarity of absolute truth. To serve is to worship, to heal is to pray, To love is to exist in harmony with God, not God as a distant judge or cosmic vending machine dispensing blessings when you press the right buttons, but God as the frequency itself, the organizing principle, the force of compassion that held atoms together and made strangers stop to help each other and compelled surgeons to work through the night to save lives they'd never profit from. Michael had spent years thinking faith required believing things he couldn't prove, accepting doctrines, following rules, performing rituals. But true faith was simpler and more demanding than that. True faith was the gesture that saved someone, the hands that healed, the choice to serve when you could have walked away, the act of love when hate would have been easier. True faith wasn't what you claimed to believe. It was what you actually did when no one was watching, and nothing was guaranteed. Michael stood slowly, brushing sand from his knees. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, beautiful in its emptiness, profound in its silence. He'd come here hoping for answers, maybe even hoping to see the craft again, to reconnect with the being who'd changed his life. But he realized he didn't need another encounter. The truth had been planted inside him like a seed, and for 6 months he'd been watering it with practice. It had taken root, grown, begun producing fruit that others could taste and recognize. The being lived in every patient he treated with reverence. 3I-ATLAS pulsed in every moment he chose compassion over fear. The cosmic consciousness flowed through every act of genuine service. They'd never really said goodbye, because love doesn't end. It just expands, ripples out, touches more lives, becomes the frequency that others begin to feel and embody and spread. Michael took a last long look at the desert, then turned and walked back toward his Jeep. Tomorrow he'd return to the hospital. More surgeries, more residents to train, more opportunities to practice the truth he'd been shown. And every single one of those moments would be prayer, worship, faith made tangible, because he'd finally learned what the being had traveled light years to teach him. Love wasn't something you felt. It was something you did. And in the doing, you became aligned with the deepest truth of existence itself. The stars emerged fully now, filling the sky with ancient light, and Michael Prescott, surgeon, student, servant, drove toward home with his heart beating in perfect rhythm with the universe.